My son set down his fork, looked across the table at his wife, then back at me, and said the house needed to go into their name by Christmas or I could find somewhere else to spend the holidays. I nodded once. I never told him what that nod actually meant. The private dining room at Salvator's smelled like garlic butter and something floral I couldn't place, lilies. Maybe arranged too perfectly in the center of the table. The air conditioning rattled in the corner vent, fighting against the Florida heat pressing against the windows. My son had reserved this room. He'd told me it was for my birthday dinner, that he wanted somewhere nice, somewhere private where we could really talk. I should have known better. The chandelier overhead threw soft yellow light across white tablecloths. And my daughter-in-law kept checking her phone under the table, her manicured nails clicking against the screen. My son wore the expression he'd learned from his father, that particular blend of concern and condescension that makes a demand sound like care. He waited until after the appetizers. Waited until I'd complimented the scallops, asked about the grandkids, smiled at their small talk about the new Tesla. Then he set down his fork with a deliberate little tap against the china, exchanged a glance with his wife, and folded his hands on the table. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about your situation." The way he said situation made my spine straighten. I set down my wine glass. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the lilies too sweet. He continued in that reasonable tone, the one he used in his sales presentations. "You're 72, the house is too much for you. The property taxes alone, we're worried about you, trying to maintain everything by yourself." I didn't speak. I've learned over the years that silence makes people reveal more than questions ever do. His wife jumped in then, her voice bright and helpful. "We've been looking at some really lovely assisted living communities. There's one in Port Charlotte with a pool, activities every day, you'd love it." Mom, she'd started calling me Mom 3 years ago. It never sounded right. My son nodded, encouraged by her support, and that's when he said it. "We think the smartest move for everyone is to transfer the house into our name. For estate planning, to avoid probate later. We'd let you stay there, of course, for as long as you're able, but this way everything's protected. Everything Dad worked for. The invoking of my dead husband. The weaponizing of his memory." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Something that had been forming for months, but now crystallized into absolute clarity. The chandelier light caught the edge of my water glass, throwing a small bright spot onto the white tablecloth. I watched it instead of my son's face. He was still talking, something about tax benefits, about making things easier for me, about how they'd already spoken to an attorney and drawn up the paperwork. "We just need your signature," he said. "Sooner is better. If we can get this done by Christmas, it'll be one less thing for you to worry about." I looked up then, met his eyes. He smiled at me the way you smile at a child who's finally understanding a difficult concept. His wife's phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it. The air conditioning rattled louder. Or maybe I was just hearing everything differently now, the false concern. The rehearsed reasoning, the trap they'd built inside a birthday dinner. I thought about the house my husband and I bought in 1981 with money we'd saved for 7 years. The house where I'd raised 2 children, buried one husband, planted 17 rose bushes, and painted every room myself after Frank died because I needed to make something new while my hands still remembered how to move. "And if I don't sign?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I intended, but steady. My son's smile tightened. He glanced at his wife. She took over, her tone still friendly but with something harder underneath. "Well, Mom, we just think it would be difficult for you to manage everything alone. Especially during the holidays. We'd hate for you to be isolated." The word hung in the air between us like a threat wrapped in tissue paper. I understood perfectly. Sign the house over or spend Christmas alone. Give them what they wanted, or lose access to my grandchildren, to family dinners, to the life I'd built around the people I loved. The waiter appeared then, asking if we were ready for entrees. My son ordered for all of us without asking what I wanted. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, and felt the weight of the choice they thought they were giving me. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college I'd paid for by working double shifts at the real estate office, and I saw a stranger wearing my child's face. I nodded once, just once. A small movement of my head that my son interpreted as confusion, as an old woman needing time to process. His shoulders relaxed. He reached across the table and patted my hand. "Don't worry, Mom," he said. "We'll handle everything." I picked up my water glass and took a small sip. The cold shocked my throat. I set it down carefully, exactly where it had been before. And I made a decision in that moment. Sitting under the too bright chandelier in a private dining room that smelled like lilies and lies. That would change everything my son thought he understood about his mother. But he didn't see it. He was already talking about dessert. About how they'd come by the house next week to go through the paperwork. About how relieved he was that I was being reasonable. I smiled, let him think I was reasonable, let him think that nod meant surrender. It didn't. The real estate office on Palm Avenue had green carpet and fluorescent lights that hummed all day like trapped insects. I started there in 1979, 26 years old with 2 kids under 5 and a husband who drove trucks long haul. The woman who hired me, Diane Sherman, 63 and sharp as a blade, looked at my application and said, "You married?" I said yes. She said happily. I didn't know how to answer that, so I told her the truth. I needed the job. She hired me on the spot. I learned everything in that office. How to read a contract, how to spot a lie. How to smile while someone tried to cheat you, and then outmaneuver them so smoothly they never saw it coming. Diane taught me that power doesn't announce itself, it just acts. By 1985, I was the top seller in the office. I remember the day I closed the Hendricks estate sale, a waterfront property that 3 other agents had given up on because the family couldn't agree on anything. I spent 4 months sitting in their lawyer's waiting room, in their accountant's office, in coffee shops and living rooms, listening to them argue. I didn't push, I just listened, found out what each person actually wanted underneath what they said they wanted. Closed the sale on a Tuesday morning in May. The commission check was for $42,000. I paid off our mortgage with it, didn't tell Frank until the paperwork came in the mail. He stood in our kitchen holding the deed, marked paid in full, and cried. He'd been carrying the weight of that house payment for 11 years, terrified every month that we'd lose it. I took the weight off his shoulders in one morning, and I remember thinking, this is what love looks like, taking care of someone without keeping score. Frank died in 2003, heart attack in the truck somewhere outside Valdosta. They found him at a rest stop, already gone. I got the call at the office on a Thursday afternoon. Diane drove me to the hospital even though there was nothing to see, nothing to do. I remember sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, the Florida sun beating down through the windshield, and feeling like I'd been cut in half. Not cleanly, jagged. I was 51 years old. My daughter was married and living in Seattle. My son was 28, working in sales, newly married himself. I thought he'd be the one who stayed close. He promised me he would. He stood at his father's funeral and held my hand and told me I'd never be alone. For a while that was true. He called every week, stopped by every Sunday with his wife and the baby. I thought I was lucky. I thought I'd raised a good son who understood family, who'd watched his father work himself to death and learned something from it. But things shifted after the second grandchild was born. The visits became shorter. The calls came less often. His wife started making comments about the house, how big it was, how much work it needed, how it was probably too much for me. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought she was being thoughtful. I thought wrong. The first time I felt the wrongness in my bones was at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. We had dinner at their house, a new build in one of those developments where every lawn looks identical and the HOA fines you for the wrong shade of mailbox. I brought my sweet potato casserole, the one my son used to beg for every holiday. His wife had already made sweet potatoes, different recipe. She put mine in the kitchen and served hers at the table, small thing, petty even. But I sat there watching my dish stay untouched in the other room and realized I was being erased. Not loudly, not with an argument. Just quietly pushed to the edges of my own family until I became a guest at tables where I used to belong. I started watching more carefully after that. Noticed how they never asked my opinion anymore, just informed me of decisions already made. Noticed how his wife answered questions I'd asked my son, spoke for him, managed him like a child. Noticed how my grandchildren called me grandma, but without the warmth I remembered from my own grandmother, just a title. A role, not a person they actually knew. I'd built a life. I'd worked 40 years, raised 2 children, buried a husband, paid off a house. And somewhere along the way, my son had decided I was a problem to be managed. An asset to be transferred, a woman too old to have a say in her own story. He was wrong about that, he just didn't know it yet. The driveway conversations started about a year before Salvator's. I'd drive over to see the grandkids, and my son would meet me outside before I could even reach the front door. He'd stand there with his hands in his pockets, his face apologetic but firm. And he'd say the kids were doing homework, or his wife had a headache. Or they were just about to sit down to dinner. I'd stand there on the stamped concrete, my purse still over my shoulder, and understand I wasn't welcome inside. He'd talk to me there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, standing between me and his house like a border guard. Then he'd give me a hug that felt like a dismissal and say he'd call me soon. He never did, I always had to call him. One Sunday in July, I remember because the heat was brutal. The kind that makes breathing feel like work, I showed up with birthday presents for my grandson. 8 years old, I'd bought him a telescope because he'd told me months before that he wanted to learn about stars. I'd spent $200 I didn't really have because that's what grandmothers do. My son met me in the driveway before I'd even turned off the car. He walked up to my window and I rolled it down. The heat poured in immediately. He leaned down, saw the wrapped telescope in the passenger seat, and sighed. Actually sighed, "Mom," he said, "we talked about this. You can't just buy the kids expensive things without checking with us first." I stared at him. We hadn't talked about it, there had been no conversation. But he said it like it was established fact, like I'd violated some rule everyone knew but me. His wife appeared in the doorway of the house, holding my grandson's hand. The boy waved at me, I waved back. My son shifted his position, blocking my view. "I'll take the present inside," he said. "But next time, ask first." Okay, he took the telescope from my car before I could respond. And I sat there in his driveway with the engine still running, watching him walk away from me carrying a gift I'd bought with money I'd earned. And I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. I didn't cry. I put the car in reverse and backed out of his perfect driveway in his perfect neighborhood, and I drove home in silence. The phone calls became interrogations. He'd call every few weeks, and the first question was always the same. "How are you doing, Mom?" It sounded like concern, it was assessment. "How's your memory? Are you forgetting things? How's your health? Are you managing the bills okay? Is the yard work getting too hard?" Every question designed to build a case that I was failing, that I needed help, that I couldn't be trusted with my own life. I started lying. Told him everything was perfect even when the air conditioning broke, and I spent 3 days sweating through August heat because I was afraid if he knew. He'd use it as evidence. Afraid he'd show up with his wife and their helpful suggestions and their patient smiles that made me feel like I was already gone. I remember the day I understood this wasn't concern. We were at a family barbecue at his wife's parents' house, one of those mandatory Sunday gatherings where everyone pretends to be closer than they are. I was sitting on their back patio, watching my grandchildren play in a sprinkler, and his wife's mother sat down next to me. Nice woman, we'd always gotten along. She leaned over quiet and said, "I hear you're thinking about selling the house." I looked at her. I'd said nothing about selling, nothing to anyone. She saw my confusion and kept talking. "My daughter mentioned you're finding it too much to handle. That you're looking at retirement communities. I think that's so smart. My sister's in one in Sarasota, and she loves it." I excused myself, went inside to the bathroom, stood there looking at my reflection in the mirror under those harsh bathroom lights. And I saw what my son saw when he looked at me. A problem, a liability, an old woman with assets he wanted and autonomy he needed to eliminate. He'd already started the narrative, already told people I was failing, that I wanted to downsize, that the move was my idea. Building the story so that when the time came to take the house, everyone would think he was helping me. No one would question it, no one would see it for what it was. I drove home that night and sat in my living room, the room I'd furnished piece by piece over 40 years. The room where my husband proposed to me, where my children took their first steps, where I'd held my grandchildren as babies, and I understood with absolute clarity that my son intended to take it all. Not because he needed it, he made good money, he had his own house, his own life. He wanted it because he could. Because I was old and female, and expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of family he chose to throw me. Because somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an inheritance he was tired of waiting for. That was the night I stopped performing, stopped pretending I didn't see what was happening, stopped hoping love would fix what power had broken. The law office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown. All glass and blonde wood, and the kind of quiet that feels expensive. My son's attorney, Richard something, I never caught his last name, had a corner office with a view of the bay. I sat in a leather chair that made a soft sighing sound when I settled into it. And I looked at the paperwork spread across the conference table like a trap someone had built out of legal language and good intentions. My son sat to my right, his wife sat across from me. The attorney sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, looking at me with practiced sympathy. The air conditioning was too cold. I'd worn a cardigan, but the chill still seeped through. Richard started talking. I let the words wash over me: estate planning, probate avoidance, tax efficiency, asset protection. He had charts, he had graphs, he had a whole presentation designed to make signing away my house sound like financial wisdom. My son nodded along, occasionally interjecting to agree, to emphasize how this was all for my benefit. His wife smiled at me encouragingly every time I glanced her way. The attorney slid the first document toward me. "This is the quitclaim deed," he said. "Very straightforward, simply transfers ownership while allowing you to retain residence for your lifetime." Lifetime. Such a gentle word for until you die. I picked up the pen he'd placed next to the paper. Held it, the weight of it felt significant in a way it shouldn't have. My son leaned forward. "Mom, if you have any questions, now's the time. We want you to feel comfortable with this," comfortable. As if comfort had anything to do with what was happening in this room. I looked at the document, looked at my son's name typed there in the recipient field. Not both children, just him. My daughter in Seattle wouldn't even know this was happening until it was done. I thought about that, how completely I'd been isolated, how thoroughly they'd planned this. "What happens," I said slowly, "if I need to sell the house?" The attorney answered before my son could. "You would need consent from the legal owners. But given that you'd have lifetime residence rights, there would be no reason to sell." I nodded. Clicked the pen open, clicked it closed, and if I wanted to take out a loan against it. "For medical expenses, say," the attorney's smile tightened slightly. "Again, you'd need owner consent. But your son has assured me he'd be available to discuss any financial needs you might have. Available to discuss. Not available to help, just to discuss, to decide, to control." My daughter-in-law spoke then, her voice honey-sweet. Mom, we'd never let you struggle. This is about protecting you, not limiting you. I looked at her. Really looked at her, saw the calculation behind the smile, the impatience she was working hard to hide. She wanted this done, wanted it settled. Wanted to move on to whatever came next, redecorating probably. Or selling it outright the moment I was safely tucked away in some facility where I couldn't object. I clicked the pen again. The sound was very loud in the quiet office. The attorney checked his watch, a small gesture, but I saw it. They had somewhere else to be. This was just an appointment on their calendar, a task to complete between lunch and whatever evening plans they'd made. To me, it was everything: the house Frank and I bought, the equity we built, the life we made. All of it reduced to signatures on a line, to legal jargon in a cold office overlooking water I couldn't quite see through the tinted glass. I set the pen down, not hard, not dramatically, just placed it carefully next to the unsigned document. I need to think about this, I said. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. My son's face did something complicated, frustration flashing across it before he forced it back to patience. Mom, we've been over this, we've explained everything. The attorneys answered all your questions. What else is there to think about? Everything, I thought. Every single thing you haven't said, every truth hidden under every lie. But I just repeated myself, my voice quiet and steady. I need to think about it. His wife made a small sound of annoyance. Covered it with a cough. The attorney gathered his papers with practiced efficiency, already moving on, already done with us. My son stood, I stood. He walked me to the elevator without speaking. In the elevator, just the two of us, he finally let the mask slip. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. I watched the numbers descend, 3rd floor, 2nd floor. I'm trying to help you and you're acting like I'm the enemy, 1st floor. The doors opened. I stepped out into the lobby with its marble floors and its fountain in the center, and I turned to look at my son. He looked so much like his father in that moment, the same jawline, the same eyes, but nothing else. Nothing underneath. I know you are, I said. I didn't specify what I knew. I let him wonder. I left him standing there and walked out into the Florida afternoon, where the heat hit me like a wall, and I could finally breathe again. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes. Just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, feeling the rage and grief and clarity move through me in waves. They'd miscalculated. They'd thought I was weak enough, old enough, confused enough to sign without resistance. They'd underestimated what 40 years in real estate teaches you about contracts and leverage and reading the room. And most of all, they'd underestimated what a mother learns when she finally accepts that the child she raised is gone and the stranger who replaced him wants everything she has. I started the car, I drove home. And I began making calls to attorneys who weren't my sons. To banks that didn't know his name. To people who would help me for reasons that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with justice. The church fellowship hall smelled like burnt coffee and the lemon furniture polish they used on the folding tables every Sunday. I started going to the women's Bible study group 3 weeks after the meeting with Richard. Just showed up one Tuesday morning, took a seat in the circle of metal chairs, and listened to women my age talk about faith and forgiveness and trusting in God's plan. I didn't say much at first. Just sat there with my hands folded, nodding at the right moments, smiling when it seemed appropriate. My son's wife attended the same church, different service, different circles. But word travels in congregations, and I knew within days he'd hear I was there. Participating, socializing, behaving like a woman who'd accepted her life exactly as it was. I ran into her in the parking lot after the 3rd week. Pure chance, or maybe not, maybe she'd been watching for me. She walked up to my car with that bright smile, asked how I was doing, told me she'd heard I'd joined the Bible study. That's wonderful, Mom. Dad would be so happy you're staying active. Dad. My dead husband invoked again like a shield. I told her I was finding comfort in community. She touched my arm, squeezed it gently. "We should have you over for dinner soon," she said. We both knew she didn't mean it. I thanked her anyway. Watched her walk away to her white SUV with the stick-figure family on the back window. Husband, wife, 2 children, 1 dog. No grandmother. I'd been edited out even in cartoon form. The days took on a strange double quality. On the surface, I was compliant. Attending church, going to the grocery store, keeping my lawn maintained. Smiling at neighbors, living small and quiet and exactly as my son wanted me to live. But underneath, in the hours between those visible moments, I was making moves he couldn't see. I met with an estate attorney named Patricia Reeves in her office 30 miles from my house. Far enough that no one from my son's circles would spot my car in the parking lot. Patricia was 58, sharp-eyed, and she listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "How much time do we have?" I told her Christmas. She nodded, "That's enough. But we move now, and we move quietly." I started transferring money in amounts small enough not to trigger attention. 500 here, 1,000 there. Moving it from the joint account I'd kept with Frank, the one my son had signature authority on in case of emergency, into a new account at a different bank under my name alone. I closed credit cards, I gathered documents. I photographed everything in the house, every piece of furniture, every dish. Every photograph on every wall, building an inventory my son didn't know existed. I worked methodically, carefully, the way I'd learned in real estate. Every step documented, every move legal. Every action designed to protect what was mine while looking like I was doing nothing at all. My son called twice during those weeks. Both times he asked how I was doing in that assessing tone I'd learned to recognize. Both times I told him I was fine, that I'd been thinking about what we discussed. That I understood he was just trying to help. I could hear the relief in his voice. He thought the resistance in the attorney's office had been a momentary lapse, an old woman's confusion giving way to reason. He had no idea that every word I spoke was chosen, that every appearance of cooperation was performance. He'd taught me that actually, taught me by example that you can smile and still be a predator. I was a better student than he'd ever been a teacher. I went to the bank on a Thursday afternoon and sat down with the branch manager. Professional woman, younger than my daughter, wearing a navy suit and the kind of smile that meant business. I told her I needed to set up a trust. She didn't ask why. Just pulled out the paperwork, walked me through the process. Explained how the trust would protect my assets from probate, from creditors. From anyone who wasn't named as beneficiary. I named my daughter in Seattle, named my grandchildren, didn't name my son. The manager notarized everything, filed everything. By the time I walked out into the afternoon heat, the house was protected in ways my son's attorney had never anticipated. Protected from him, that Sunday I went to his house for dinner. First time in 3 months I'd been invited inside. His wife had cooked pot roast. She served it with a smile that looked genuine until you looked at her eyes. My grandchildren were polite and distant, trained like small diplomats. My son sat at the head of the table in the chair he'd bought to match the one his father used to sit in. And he told me about his promotion at work, his plans for a vacation in Aruba, his ideas for renovating their kitchen. I listened, complimented the food, asked questions about the grandchildren. Played the role of grateful mother so well that when I left that evening, he walked me to my car and hugged me and whispered, "I'm glad you're doing better. Mom, I was worried about you for a while." I drove home through streets I'd known for 40 years. Past houses I'd sold and neighborhoods I'd watched grow. And I felt nothing but clarity. Cold, absolute, perfect clarity. My son thought he'd won. Thought he'd managed me back into compliance. That the signing was just a matter of time now. A formality he'd schedule once he was certain I wouldn't resist again. He had no idea what I'd built in the silence he'd mistaken for surrender. No idea that every smile I'd given him was a blade I was sharpening. No idea that the performance was almost over and the curtain was about to fall. The bank branch on Cypress Avenue opened at 9. I was there at 8:57, waiting in the parking lot, watching the employees unlock the doors through my windshield. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of November day that reminds you why people move to Florida. I walked inside carrying a leather folder that contained every document Patricia had prepared. Every form I'd signed. Every piece of paper that would make what came next legal and permanent and absolutely final. The same branch manager saw me and smiled with recognition. She led me to her office without me having to ask. We worked for 90 minutes. I signed release forms. I signed transfer authorizations. I signed documents that moved my house into the trust. Moved my savings into accounts my son couldn't touch. Moved every asset I owned beyond his reach. The branch manager worked quietly and efficiently, sliding papers across her desk. Pointing where I needed to sign, witnessing my signature with her own. When we finished, she shook my hand and said something I'll never forget. I hope he deserved this. I didn't ask who she meant, we both knew. I walked out of that bank a different woman than the one who'd walked in, lighter somehow. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set it down. From the bank, I drove to the post office on Market Street. Inside, the air smelled like cardboard and the faint chemical scent of ink. I'd already packed the boxes, 12 of them taped and labeled, sitting in my car. They contained everything I wanted to keep. Photographs, letters, my grandmother's dishes, the quilt my mother made, Frank's watch. The telescope I'd bought my grandson that had never been given to him. Everything else could stay. Everything else was just furniture, just objects, just the props of a life I was leaving behind. The postal worker, a young man with headphones around his neck, helped me carry the boxes inside. I shipped them to my daughter's address in Seattle. Priority, insured, tracked, gone. Next was the attorney's office, but not Richard's. Patricia's office was in a building that looked nothing like the glass tower where my son had tried to trap me. This was brick and small windows, and a waiting room with chairs that had seen better days. Patricia met me at the door herself. We sat in her office surrounded by file cabinets and law books, and she handed me the final documents. The trust was filed, the deed was transferred not to my son, to the trust. The beneficiary designations were changed. The power of attorney I'd given my son years ago was revoked and replaced with one naming my daughter. Every legal thread that connected me to his control was cut. He'll contest this, Patricia said, not a question, a statement. I nodded. Let him try, I said. She smiled then, a real smile, and slid one more document across the desk. A letter she'd written on my behalf to my son's attorney, informing him that I was represented by counsel and all future communications should go through her office. Professional, courteous, final, I signed it. She promised to send it certified mail that afternoon. I thanked her, paid her retainer in full from my new account. Walked back out into the sunshine feeling like I'd just won a war no one else knew had been fought. The last stop was the storage facility on Route 41. I'd rented a unit the week before, 10 by 10, climate-controlled, paid a year in advance. I spent the afternoon moving through my house, loading my car with the things that mattered, more photographs, my sewing machine, Frank's tools, the paintings I'd collected over the years, the crystal my mother left me. Trip after trip, loading and unloading, my back aching but my mind clear. By sunset, the storage unit was full, and the house looked almost the same as it had that morning, but emptied of everything that meant anything. The furniture stayed, the appliances stayed, the shell stayed. Everything real was gone. I drove home as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink and purple. I parked in my driveway, walked into the house, stood in the living room where I'd stood 1,000 times before, and it felt like a stranger's space. Not mine anymore, not anyone's, just a building, just walls and floors and a roof. I'd spent 43 years there, and now I was leaving it behind the way you leave behind a skin that no longer fits. I thought about calling my son, thought about explaining. But explanations are for people who might understand, and he'd proven he never would. Instead, I packed a suitcase, just one, clothes for a week, my medication, my laptop, the folder of documents. I set it by the front door. Tomorrow morning, I'd pick it up and walk out and never come back. Tonight, I slept in my own bed one last time, and I didn't dream at all. The airport terminal was crowded for a Monday morning. I sat at gate B7, waiting for my flight to Seattle, and I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. My suitcase was checked. My daughter was waiting on the other end. My phone was in my purse, turned off. Because I knew what was coming, and I didn't want to hear it until I was 35,000 feet away and beyond his reach. The departure board showed my flight on time. I bought a coffee from the Starbucks kiosk, found a seat near the window, and watched planes take off into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. My son discovered what I'd done at approximately 10:30 that morning. I know because my daughter called me later and told me the timeline. He'd gone to his house, as he'd started calling it in his mind, to check on some repair he claimed needed doing. Let himself in with the key I'd never asked him to return. Walked through rooms that looked right until he started noticing what was missing. The photographs, the crystal, my grandmother's dishes. He called me first, got voicemail. Called again, voicemail. Then he called the bank to ask about my accounts. Probably planning to check that I was still managing my money appropriately. That's when someone, following protocols I'd specifically requested, informed him the accounts had been closed. I imagine him sitting in his car in my driveway, his perfect control fracturing, calling his attorney. Richard would have told him about the letter from Patricia. Would have explained that I'd retained counsel, revoked his power of attorney, established a trust. I imagine Richard's voice trying to stay professional while delivering news that destroyed every plan my son had made. I imagine my son's face going red, his voice getting loud, the way it did when he was a teenager and didn't get his way. But he wasn't a teenager anymore. He was a grown man who just learned that his elderly mother had outmaneuvered him completely. He drove to Patricia's office. She told me this later, her voice amused and impressed in equal measure. Showed up demanding to speak with her, demanding to know what I'd done. Demanding access to documents that were none of his business. She had her paralegal call security. My son left before they arrived, but not before making enough noise that everyone on that floor knew exactly what kind of man he was. Then he did what weak men always do when power fails. He called his wife. And she called my daughter-in-law's mother. And within 2 hours half the county knew some version of a story where I was the villain. Ungrateful mother, senile old woman, manipulated by lawyers. Every version carefully constructed to make him the victim. I was at 32,000 feet when he finally reached my daughter. She called me from Seattle after she'd hung up on him. Told me he'd screamed at her, actually screamed, demanding to know if she was part of this, if she'd helped me where I was. She told him the truth. I'd asked for help and she'd given it, and if he ever spoke to her that way again, she'd block his number permanently. Then she asked me if I was okay, really asked the way she used to when she was small and I'd come home from work exhausted. I told her I was better than okay. I told her I was free. I thought about him sitting in that house, my house. The one he'd never own now, surrounded by furniture he couldn't sell and walls he couldn't control. Finally understanding that I'd seen him clearly. That I'd known what he was planning before he'd fully planned it himself. That I'd let him think he was managing me while I was 3 steps ahead the entire time. Would you like to know what I learned about dignity? Sometimes it looks like surrender right up until the moment it doesn't. Sometimes it's quiet enough to be mistaken for weakness. And sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is walk away from people who have spent years teaching her she has no right to leave. My flight landed in Seattle at 1:15 Pacific time. My daughter met me at baggage claim. We didn't talk about my son. We collected my suitcase, walked out into rain that felt like a baptism, and drove to her house through streets I'd never seen before in a city I'd never lived in. She'd prepared the guest room, put flowers on the nightstand, hung towels in the bathroom, made space for me like I'd made space for her whole life. That night we sat in her kitchen, not mine. Hers, drinking tea and talking about everything except the family I'd left behind in Florida. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like someone's mother again instead of someone's mark. The botanical garden greenhouse smelled like wet earth and something green and growing. I discovered it 2 weeks after I arrived in Seattle, walking through my daughter's neighborhood, trying to learn the geography of my new life. The greenhouse was public, part of a community garden project, and it became my place. I'd go there in the mornings with my coffee, sit on the wooden bench near the orchids, and watch light filter through glass panels onto leaves that didn't care about property deeds or family betrayal. The woman who managed the garden, Rose, which felt almost too perfect to be real, asked if I wanted to volunteer. I said yes, started coming 3 times a week, got dirt under my fingernails again. Remembered what it felt like to grow something that didn't demand anything back. My son tried to reach me for 6 weeks, calls I didn't answer, voicemails I deleted without listening, emails that went straight to a folder I never opened. Patricia handled the legal aftermath. He did try to contest the trust. Filed papers claiming I lacked capacity, that I'd been unduly influenced, that the transfer was fraudulent. Patricia buried him in documentation, medical records showing perfect cognition, bank statements showing careful planning, testimony from the bank manager about my clear instructions. The judge dismissed his case in less than 10 minutes. Patricia said my son left the courtroom looking like a man who'd finally run out of moves. She sounded satisfied, so was I. His wife called my daughter once, asked if I was getting the help I needed. My daughter asked what kind of help she meant. The silence on the other end of the line apparently lasted long enough to answer the question. My daughter told her I was fine, I was happy, and I'd made my position clear. Then she hung up. We never heard from her again. The grandchildren, I think about them sometimes. Wonder if they'll remember me. Wonder what story they've been told about why grandma disappeared. Hope someday they'll be old enough to ask questions and wise enough to recognize the answers they're given might not be true. But I can't save them from their father. I can only save myself. I sold the house in January, not to my son. He tried to buy it through an LLC thinking I wouldn't notice. I noticed. Sold it to a young family with 3 kids and a dog. People who'd fill those rooms with the kind of life Frank and I once had there. Used the proceeds to buy a small condo in Seattle, walking distance from my daughter, with a balcony where I grow tomatoes and herbs. The money that's left is in the trust, safe for my grandchildren, accessible when they're 25 and old enough to understand that security isn't the same thing as control. My son will never touch it, neither will his wife. That's not revenge, that's just math. My daughter asked me once if I missed him, her brother, my son. I thought about it for a long time before I answered, told her the truth. I miss who I thought he was. Miss the child I raised, the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, the young man who cried at his father's funeral. But that person either never existed or died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone I don't recognize and don't particularly like. You can love a memory and still refuse to be destroyed by the person wearing its face. She understood. She'd already done her own version of that math years before when she moved 3,000 miles away. I saw him once, months later, pure accident. I was visiting a friend in Tacoma and we stopped at a restaurant for lunch. He was there, business trip probably. He didn't see me at first. I watched him across the room, talking on his phone, gesturing with his free hand the way his father used to, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, nothing, just the blank space where a son used to be. Then he looked up, our eyes met. He stood, started walking toward my table. I stood too. Put money on the table, told my friend we were leaving. Walked past my son without speaking, without stopping, without acknowledging him at all. He said my name, I kept walking. Some doors once closed don't open again. He'd spent years teaching me that. I'd finally learned. The greenhouse is where I am most days now. Working with Rose, teaching occasional classes on container gardening. Helping kids from the neighborhood school plant seeds and learn patience. There's a specific peace in putting your hands in soil, in coaxing something green from something that looks like death. I'm 73 now, older than I was when this started, but younger than I've felt in years. My daughter stops by sometimes, brings her kids, lets them help me water the seedlings. They call me grandma and they mean it. They know me, that's the difference. That's everything. I have a life here, small, quiet, completely mine. No one asks me to sign anything. No one manages me. No one mistakes my silence for confusion or my kindness for weakness. I learned what I needed to learn. I did what I needed to do. And now I'm here in a greenhouse that smells like rain and growth, holding a future my son will never be part of. That's not a tragedy, that's just the truth. There are things you learn when the people who are supposed to love you show you who they really are. You learn that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, that raising someone doesn't mean they'll honor what you built. That a lifetime of sacrifice can be erased by a signature someone demands at a dinner table while the chandelier light catches their wine glass and they smile like they're doing you a favor. You learn that family can be the most dangerous word in the English language when it's used as a weapon instead of a shelter. I spent 43 years in that house, raised 2 children there, buried a husband. Survived everything life handed me with the stubborn belief that if I just worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, gave freely enough, I'd be safe. That my son would protect what his father and I built because that's what children do, they honor their parents. They carry forward the legacy, they remember where they came from. I was wrong about that, not because all children are ungrateful. Because power changes people and money reveals them. And sometimes the child you raised becomes someone you wouldn't trust with $1, let alone a deed. Here's what no one tells you about getting old as a woman. The world stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a problem to solve. You're too much or too little, too dependent or too stubborn, too confused or too sharp. There's no right way to age if you're female because the goal was never to help you. It was to move you out of the way so someone younger and hungrier could take what you spent your life building. My son didn't invent that playbook, he just learned it well. And I had to learn something harder, that defending yourself doesn't make you cruel. That choosing your own survival over someone else's comfort doesn't make you selfish. That walking away from family who treat you like an asset instead of a person is not abandonment, it's liberation. I think about the women who can't leave. The ones whose sons or daughters or partners take the house, take the money, take the dignity, and there's no attorney they can call. No daughter in Seattle waiting with a guest room. No strength left after years of being worn down word by word, decision by decision. Until they're ghosts in their own lives. I think about them every time I'm in the greenhouse. Every time I wake up in a home I chose. Every time I make a decision without asking permission. I got out, so many don't, not because they're weaker, because the trap was better built. Because they were more isolated, because they believed longer than I did that love would eventually win. It doesn't always. Sometimes all love does is make you vulnerable to people who have learned to use your heart against you. If you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, if someone in your family is managing you, moving you, making decisions about your life while calling it help, please hear this. You are not confused, you are not ungrateful, you are not the problem. You're being erased, and it's happening slowly enough that everyone around you thinks it's normal. It's not, you built what you built, you earned what you earned. No one has the right to take it simply because you're old or tired or trusting. Get help, find an attorney who works for you, not your family, move your money. Document everything. And if you have to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, choose yourself every single time. My son thinks I'm bitter. I've heard through my daughter that he tells people I changed, that I turned against him, that lawyers poisoned my mind. He's wrong about that. I didn't change, I clarified. I became the truest version of myself I'd ever been, the version that wouldn't smile through betrayal. Wouldn't surrender for the sake of appearances, wouldn't mistake compliance for love. That version of me was always there. She just needed to get angry enough to act. And anger, the right kind of anger. The cold, clear kind that sees injustice and refuses to accept it. That anger saved my life. I don't hate my son. Hate requires energy I don't have and attention he doesn't deserve. What I feel is simpler than hate. I see him. I see exactly who he is, what he wanted, how he tried to take it. And I made sure he couldn't. That's not revenge. That's just refusing to be a victim. There's a difference. Revenge is about making them hurt the way they hurt you. Refusal is about making sure they can't hurt you again. One keeps you tied to them forever. The other sets you free. I chose freedom. It cost me a son, but I'd already lost him anyway. What I gained was myself. The greenhouse taught me something I'm still learning. That growth requires the right conditions, and sometimes the right condition is distance from the thing that's killing you. You can't bloom in shadow. You can't thrive in soil someone else is poisoning. You can transplant yourself. You can start over. You can be 73 years old with dirt under your nails and a future you chose instead of one you were handed. That's not a small thing, that's everything. And if I could go back to that dinner table at Salvador's, to the moment my son gave me the ultimatum, I'd do it all exactly the same. I'd nod once, I'd let him think he'd won, and I'd walk away knowing that the strongest thing I ever did was refuse to stay. This has been Grandma's last word. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, because every week another woman tells the truth someone tried to bury.